Dr. Ken Tate, University of California, Department of Plant Sciences, CE Specialist in Rangeland Hydrology.
Yeah.
And the chair of the Ristici.
I hold one of the Ristici chairs.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll get out of here.
How are you all doing? You go ahead and get the slides up. So one of the things we did today is, you saw on the agenda we were going to limit this to 70 people, and within the first 3 days we had 70 people sign up. And we thought we shouldn't constrain this. We should go ahead and keep this open. So I think we have about 130 people that registered for this. One of the things that we did, and we hope you're all comfortable with it, as I was looking through, Tracy Shore and I were looking through the sign-up list, the diversity of people that signed up for this and the interest groups that they represent was really amazing. And so we included that so that everybody's contact information, and so you can get a sense of, I think, how, from my perspective in the last 15 years, how much the range community in California has grown. And so I think the opportunities for us to collaborate are become immense. And throughout today, please ask questions that stimulate discussion. As we go along, if you have questions during the presentations, please go for it. And so I have the relatively easy job today of leading off. I just get to paint the broad picture of what we're going to talk about, and my following speakers will fill in with meaningful details. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how things have changed in our perspective. And this field station, which has been here for over 50 years, reflects that change in the types of ecosystem services that we expect from California's rangelands, and I'd say from rangelands globally. And so we still expect and require livestock production off of our rangelands. Yet at the same time now, society in general and many of us are expecting simultaneously that we'll achieve diversity, which in California and your rangelands may mean our common enemy of noxious weeds. And the fact that these invasions, which have a negative aspect for livestock production, also can affect diversity in our plant community. And Valerie will talk a bit about that. A lot of interest in habitat, growing interest in climate regulation, and the capacity of rangelands, just due to their huge extent across the globe, to sequester carbon. Perhaps simply conserving rangelands from transition to a different land use might be the single most important thing that we can do, and you can see that in the structure of the California Rangeland Coalition Conservation. In California, clean and safe water is absolutely critical. We have two colleagues here from South Texas who can talk about just the need for water of any sort, given the drought that they've been going through. Dirty water would be fine, potentially, in South Texas right now. And in many parts of California and throughout the United States, the concerns about just maintaining open space, maintaining places that are open and natural where these benefits can occur. And so thinking back in time and thinking about our transitions from a focus on the primary use that we've made of rangelands for quite some time is just the production of food and fiber. And I think we can all admit that in the past we've expected unsustainable levels of production of food and fiber from our rangelands. This is a photo that I've got, and it's in Utah about 1922, according to the person that I got it from. And it shows, you can see these dead stems. This is an aspen stand in Utah, and that aspen, these are sheep throughout it, and there's the herder. And so we've got basically heavy sheep grazing and probably other things occurring in that landscape at the time that removed the aspen from that landscape. Research that we've done recently shows that in the Sierra Nevada, aspen are equal to riparian areas and mountain meadows in terms of providing herbaceous diversity at the landscape level. And there's less than 20% overlap between the plant communities that exist in aspen stands and the plant communities that exist in meadows. So this type of, the trade-off of making heavy use in this landscape and the loss of diversity at a site as well as a landscape level can be immense. Here at SF Rec, today we'll take you as we go into the field up onto beautiful open grassland, which didn't used to be an open grassland. It used to be an oak woodland. And so in addition to making potentially unsustainable use in the past, we had very much the idea of engineering the landscape to support livestock, to maximize livestock production. And here in SF Rec, about the 1960s was kind of the heyday of basically converting oak woodland and converting shrublands to open grassland to increase stocking rate. Leslie Roach will talk a bit about some work she's done here, but we're looking at 50-60% increases in stocking rate as a result of this kind of brush management. That's pretty sustainable production. And in that, through those eras of creating this agro-ecosystem that we call California's annual rangelands, we did it quite well. And it's a resource, the important resource within the state. Sorry about that. The California's annual grasslands, the Golden Hills of California, provide 70% of the state's annual forage base and are integral in supporting an over $3 billion annual beef cattle industry. That's not to be taken lightly, particularly in difficult economies such as this, particularly in rural counties where this is the primary source of revenue. So it's an important service, and we should not diminish it. We just need to look at it in the context of the other services we'd like to enhance as well. And so expectations over time have changed, and thus management, and from our perspective, research has changed. And to pick on University of California Cooperative Extension, why not? We respond to what society wants, we believe. And in the 60s and 50s and 60s, we published documents with titles such as Grass, Not Oaks, Make Your Cows Fat. And so you could go into the Tehama County Cooperative Extension office and you could get a handout that told you, and supplies to kill oaks, and told you how to do it very effectively. And so we spent a significant amount of our time helping people maximize the ecosystem service of livestock production on annual rangeland. And then the winds of change came, so we drift right with them, right? And the Integrated Hardwood Range Management Program came into being because of concerns that once we remove these oaks from the landscape, it's really difficult to get them back. And potentially we're losing a lot of other conservation benefits that we're interested in. And so we spent 20 years getting rid of oaks, spent another 30 trying to get them back. Both types of research occurred on this very facility over time. Those of you that graze in public lands or graze on areas where we're concerned about mountain meadows or concerned about riparian areas know that over time expectations, say on public grazing allotments for how riparian areas might look have changed dramatically. If you look back into the old literature, look back into the old So if we look back into the old way of doing business, we had this concept that riparian areas were sacrifice areas. They used to be called that. Can any of you conceive of calling a riparian area a sacrifice area today? It's just not conceivable, but it was very common because in order to make efficient use of all the upland feed, you basically had to feed off the area pretty heavily before cattle would move up and use those areas. This gives you an example, and I'll follow up on this. This is the same stream within a mile, and both of those are grazed by livestock. And so, without a doubt, we can manage grazing to sustain riparian areas or degrade them. The question is how are we able to accomplish that? And what are the costs? What are the trade-offs that occur in doing that? In California, we're a bit unique in that we have other concerns and other expectations. About 85% of our drinking water, surface water supplies in California come or derive from rangeland watersheds, many of which are privately owned, many of which are grazed. And this is the Yuba River, This is the Yuba River just below this field station, provides significant drinking water. Something else that's come to light with continued persistent outbreaks of microbial pathogens, microbial disease in fresh produce crops is the fact that we use a significant amount of water to irrigate. And so the potential for fresh produce crops to be irrigated with water that might have been contaminated by livestock production systems is a new concern that we have in places such as the Salinas Valley and others. Maybe if I hold it, it'll be better. And so we're very concerned about this and this proximity, this cohabitation, if you will, of fresh produce, wildlife, as well as cattle. Grassland birds. Across grasslands in North America, we're concerned about the decline of grassland birds. So thinking about all of this together, in a balance. So I worked hard at this, and I hope it works out for you. Those of you that are engineers will know that this probably would work. This would probably balance. And so basically what we have at hand, let's try a different one. It's really distracting. I don't know about you guys. That's what's doing it. Is it better? Okay. As the cell phone goes away, maybe. That actually works. Okay. So, were you guys able to hear what I was saying earlier?
No.
Oh, you should have spoke up, people.
Yeah, we could.
You guys could? Okay. So, where we're at now is how. It's worse. Okay. I'm going to try to speak loud. How's that sound?
We won't get it on tape unless you use the mic.
What about the clicker?
Try this one.
Is it the clicker? You want to try manual advance? Okay, so, no? Okay. From very much a focus on managing for single services livestock production and managing for a single service of livestock production, yet we've got multiple expectations now on this landscape. And the challenge that we have as managers and as interested parties is to figure out how to balance these needs. And so, I think that everything has to have some equal weight if we're going to make this work. Otherwise, this whole system can potentially fall apart. So if you go forward, please, advance. And so as we go into today, Leslie is going to talk a bit about trade-offs and synergies that exist when we try to manage for one particular ecosystem service. We might benefit others, but we could degrade others at the same time. So getting at this idea of trade-offs, and Leslie will use work that she's doing here focusing on oak management. So if we manage oaks for livestock production, what are some of the trade-offs that we see in other ecosystem services? Justin Derner from Wyoming will talk to us a bit about work they've done in Wyoming and Colorado to blend goals that we have for the same landscape, to blend the goals of livestock production with the goals for enhancing grassland bird habitat as the model system that he'll talk about. We'll talk about values. So if we think about this as being a balancing act, I've talked a significant amount just recently about if we over-optimize for ranch profit, perhaps some of these other things are degraded and damaged. Equally so, since it's a balancing act, and those of you from the East Bay and other areas where there's a lot of potential development pressure, know that if we overbalance some of these other goals, which are valuable and consistently, theoretically ought to be of equal value to us as a society, if we overweight some of those, we might detriment ranch profit to the fact that we can't have a sustainable agricultural enterprise in this landscape. As that starts to fall apart, that landscape might transition into another land use. It certainly won't sit vacant. We know that. Something will happen. And it may or may not cause in the long run a loss of these habitat values. So we have to keep that in mind, and it all has to be at the table. And so Mark LaBelle from Davis is going to talk to us a bit about a survey that we've initiated and conducted. He's beginning to analyze the results, getting at rancher perspectives and goals and decision making explicitly relative to ecosystem services. We also have to fundamentally understand the system. So I created this balance. I don't know that it really works. We have to understand the parts and how things are connected. And so Valerie's going to talk a bit about, we still have significant gaps in our understanding of how this ecosystem works and how it's connected. So for instance, if you start managing explicitly for nutrient cycling, she'll use the case of nitrogen as a bit of an example. What does that do? How does that connect, and how might that upset or not upset the balance that's controlling how these other ecosystem services would respond? And so if we think then about the tools that we have at hand, and what do we know about them to try and achieve some of this balance, we have a lot of the old tried and true tools that we've always had available in rangeland. We've used them well in the past explicitly to increase livestock production. Yet we know from experience and certainly a significant amount of research, these same sets of practices can be used to either mitigate or offset potential negative impacts that might happen from grazing, or increase an ecosystem service that we decide we can now market. If we can identify a carbon market for a market for carbon, we might start managing potentially more for carbon if we have something we can sell and maintain ranch profit and offset changes that we might put in place. And so prescribed grazing, managing the intensity, the season, the frequency of grazing, and rest. Rest is critical. The grazing facilities that are required to achieve control over timing, intensity, frequency of grazing and rest. So simple things like fences, off-site water. If we fence a riparian area so that we can manage grazing within it, we've probably got to put drinking water in the new upland pasture. That cannot be forgotten, and there's a cost to that. So arranging those things and implementing them. We have a lot of other tools available to us. Some of them maybe not as practically implemented for many reasons across a broader landscape as grazing, which is occurring prevalently. Prescribed fire can be a really important tool. Weed control practices, herbicidal practices, planting and seeding, mechanical treatments such as mowing or cutting of a noxious species. Restoration practices that we might not traditionally use in rangelands but might be brought to bear to fix some of our problems, and just general habitat improvement. So we have a lot of tools at hand to use, and there's a report that's coming out that I just want to draw your attention to and use as a platform to discuss a few things. And the USDA and several people in this room were instrumental in getting this developed, commissioned at the request of the Government Accounting Office and various others, commenced a review to get at the effectiveness of conservation practices. So as you know, USDA is funding a significant amount of conservation practices on private and public lands. I think this fiscal year to the tune of $4 billion were spent on conservation practices. And so the question was, well, what do we really know about these practices? How effective are they? And how much can they be supported by management experience, and how much can they be supported by the published research? And so USDA commissioned a panel of 40 scientists to investigate the effectiveness of these practices. And so we looked at a suite of things, and kind of some of the take-home messages that I took from that report, which will be available online by the end of this month. It'll be a very up-to-date literature review for folks that are interested. Was that research does support many of these tools. We know that prescribed fire can have ecosystem benefit. There's a spider. Diversity right here, right there. We know that prescribed fire, for instance, can have value for certain ecosystem services. One of the things that we find from looking at the literature, at studies to evaluate these, is that we often looked at a single tool applied and looking at a single outcome. So we looked at prescribed fire on herbage production. But we didn't look at any of the other possible outcomes that we might expect or could benefit from. We also didn't take into account that people don't use one tool at a time, generally. They tend to have a toolbox and arrange 3 or 4 or 5 tools out of that toolbox on their piece of property as a first point to make progress towards their objectives, and then to adaptively manage and use those tools as they progress. It's difficult in a research setting to do that because the scientific method, remind us, we hold everything constant and allow one thing to vary. And that's a great way to get at causation, but perhaps not in a complex human, social, economic, ecological, biophysical model, such as the pasture right outside of this building. And because of that, one of the reasons it's extremely difficult then to extrapolate the hundreds of research papers, thousands of research papers that have been conducted, all of which, the vast majority of which, practically all of mine, are valuable. I know mine are. It's difficult to extrapolate to the ecosystem of the ranch scale, which is what we're all interested in. And so we've got to start putting these pieces together. And so one of the quotes I pulled out of SEEP, the executive summary, which I thought was simple but absolutely true, is that partnerships among scientists, managers, and policymakers will provide the most relevant knowledge to guide conservation science and planning. So stop doing science in a vacuum. Stop doing policy in a vacuum. Stop managing in a vacuum. Let's work together and move forward to solve our collective interests. And so if you think about SEEP, and one of the things, kind of the way I'm bringing this together, if we think about research then, we tend to look at artificial controlled management systems in general. Treatments that we identify as academics. In reality, application, we have adaptively implemented management strategies. So we're studying systems that may not overlap entirely with what folks are doing and include all of the components that would go into the application of range management for one or more ecosystem services. Note I have some overlap, because there's certainly studies out there, and there's a lot of groups that are working hard to make this overlap. The challenge is that we've got to increase the level of that overlap, and that's part of what today is about, to start those conversations and to talk about some research that we're doing, and hopefully some collaborations on future research to increase that overlap for all of our benefit. And so to give you an example of what we mean by that, the kinds of opportunities that exist to better study, better overlap research and management at the ecosystem scale, looking at multiple ecosystem services. A project that we did quite some time ago, Teresa Ward, at that time Teresa Bichetti, I think is in the audience. This was her master's project. And so we did a project where we surveyed hundreds of grazed riparian areas throughout California rangelands. Because in surveying ranches and looking around, there's, these two sites are within a mile of each other. We see that under different management, that same stream can provide different levels of ecosystem services. So there's the good, the bad, the ugly, so to speak. There's a whole gradient of management and riparian response out there. It's occurring at the management scale. Can we learn from that? So basically, we did a cross-sectional survey where we looked at hundreds of sites, went out, interviewed the rancher, the on-the-ground manager, about their grazing practices. What exactly do you do? And we took a snapshot look at the health, if you will, of that riparian area. And we did statistical black magic to piece it together. And so what we found correlated with riparian health was all these practices that we have at hand that we've not really been able to study very well at the constrained plot scale, if you will, because it's hard to constrain a stream or reach a riparian area to a plot scale. It doesn't work. It's a continuum. We found that off-site attractants, such as water tanks and supplements, providing off of the stream things that cattle would like to have, is a good thing. Herding, the old tried and true act of managing livestock distribution on horseback, still has value for modern application. Rest period duration, cattle density during grazing bouts, frequency of grazing bouts per year. So to get at some of the correlations we saw, things that were negatively correlated, so riparian health as measured by about 30 metrics, kind of uniformly declined as we increased stock density. More animals, more pressure. Duration of grazing, longer periods of grazing, more pressure on the riparian area. Basically not managing our grazing pressure. Frequency of grazing, how many times you came back and grazed that riparian area during the course of a year. Positive correlations, duration of rest from grazing between bouts. Herding. It was interesting, it wasn't yes, no, do you herd? It was the amount of time in person days per year that you spent. It's effort, not the actual practice itself. And so one of the things we're finding is, and SEEP pulled this out as well, the effectiveness of a conservation practice is probably more defined by the amount of effort and innovation that you put into implementing it and adapting it to your local scenario, as opposed to just blindly implementing that practice following a tech guide. Key elements in terms of successful management where ecosystem services have to be a goal of the manager. There's no silver bullet. All of these practices work somewhere. It's how well you implemented them. And there has to be site-specific adaptive management. And so today, kind of giving that as an example, we'll go through a process of talking about, from some folks that have been thinking about this for quite a while, some of the current research on managing for services. What are we doing now? A rancher survey getting at, so what do ranchers think in California about these services goals, how to manage for them. We'll talk about a grazing trial, which is us starting a new trial, an intermittent study, if you will, to move towards a new way of thinking about managing research grazing trials and having stakeholders be participating in the definition of the treatments so that the treatments are more real relative to what people actually do on the ground. We'll talk a bit about a ranch survey, expanding, if you will, taking potentially this riparian survey that we talked about and expanding it to look at more than just riparian areas, as well as bringing economic enterprise level information as well as decision-making processes into it. And in general, our goal here is just to improve links between research and management. So as we go forward on this topic, we can make progress. So with that, thank you for your time.